Hello and welcome back to the show. My guest today is Dr. William Parham. He's a professor in the counseling program at Loyola Marymount University, a licensed psychologist, and the director of the Mental Health and Wellness Program for the National Basketball Players Association. Mental health is often overlooked, especially in high-performance environments like sports. Whether you're an athlete or just navigating daily life, talking about mental health can be incredibly difficult. How does culture shape our understanding of mental health, and why is it so often stigmatized? Expect to learn about Dr. Parham's concept of invisible tattoos, the impact of social media and AI on mental health today, the powerful connection between physical and mental well-being, and how trauma can lead to personal growth in unexpected ways, and much more. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's a conversation with Dr. William Parham. Welcome, Dr. Parham.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Hope you and your loved ones are doing well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. It's an honor to finally have you on the show. I'm going to jump right into it. Our episode today is going to be about mental health and mental resilience. I was wondering what initially drew you to focus on this area, especially with athletes. I know that you have extensive background with athletes, and I've been fascinated with the concept of mental health, but when it comes to athletes, I feel like I don't know anything. So I would really appreciate it if you could shed some light on that.
Sure. Well, mental health and working with people has always been part of what I feel I was called to do. I'm not an office person. I'm not mechanical. So for whatever reason, I always had a calling to work with folks. And so psychology was the most interesting major for me. Certainly I pursued that in graduate school. Because what psychology is really the study of how people think, feel, and behave, and how they essentially respond. For me, that's the ultimate puzzle. I'll get to this a little bit later, but a key word for me is teaching people how to respond to life's challenges. And so people respond in various ways, and there are many factors that influence the decisions they make, et cetera. And so it's always been a fascination to me. I've always been connected to sports, to answer the second part of your question. And I've always been in admiration of what seems like miraculous talent. There's just an artistry, a competence, a command, a swag. And athletes are high performers who are gifted, who really worked at their craft, and who it becomes a part of who they are, what they do. And to have to think on the spot, to be very creative, to read the field of either the court or football field or soccer, whatever it is you're doing, and to make quick decisions about that. To also understand teammates and how each piece fits. That's always just been fascinating to me. As I dug deeper, though, and as I became a professional, even before I was a professional, mental health was just not really talked about at all. And in fact, not only was it not talked about, it was people were incentivized to not talk about it. I don't know any culture, any community, domestic or global, where sort of the family mandate is you don't air family linen, you don't talk to anybody about anything. Then when you put on several different lenses like men don't talk and share feelings as much as women do, for example. When you put on the element of celebrity in terms of high profile athletes or high powered folks, when you put on a number of lenses, you're even more incentivized to say nothing. And as a result of wanting to be good citizens, good athletes, good whatever, you sort of obey what the invisible mandate is. You don't say anything. And you feel that even though you were successful and accomplished by all markers, somehow you've overcome whatever it is bothering you, but that's never true. And I'll get to that later. But again, what fascinated me, putting mental health and sport, my interest in psychology together, I was always puzzled early in my career. I'm no longer puzzled. As a certain sport, such as basketball, football, there's a high number of African American athletes. But when I was coming up, there were no African American psychologists doing what I do. Literally, I could count maybe 5 in the whole United States. And that was a concern. It was an observation I made. But I figured, let me get into this field, specifically in athletes, and be a model representation of somebody who looks like the people I'm serving. And that tended to be a good decision. I think guys resonated to that. And I've been doing this ever since. So I've been actually working in that space for about 30 years. And I've enjoyed every minute of it. So it really is passion for psychology, understanding the puzzle of humanity and the interactions that go on, looking through several lenses of culture, race, ethnicity, et cetera, but also being very specific and deserving and wanting to deliver service to populations that were traditionally marginalized. So that, in short, is sort of how I got to where I'm at.
I see. That's very profound. I really appreciate your answer on that.
Yeah.
Speaking of culture and cultural influences on mental health, I've realized that culture plays a big role in how we look at mental health and how we pursue help for it. I was wondering if you think that there is still work to do in terms of diversifying the field and recruiting people for specifically what you're doing in order to cater to a broader population and serve them the way that in a way that matches their backgrounds.
To give you a straight answer, yes, there's always a need for recruitment. But to back up a little bit, before we get into the recruitment, before we really talk about culture,
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to talk about the perceptions of mental health, mental wellness, mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
Mental health is an inextricable part of who we are. It's a fundamental part of our DNA, of how we operate. There's nobody who doesn't have mental health. All of it isn't healthy necessarily, and there are people who have challenges. But you can't separate out mental health from physical health, from spiritual health. It's part of who we are. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to get into, mental health / mental illness, which is the historical word, was very taboo, was a bad thing. There are any number of stories that really suggest that when family members and community members were mentally ill, they went into what they used to call asylums. At the extreme, the insane asylum. And the treatment, quote, interventions were nothing short of barbaric, very demeaning, shoot from the hip, not scientifically based. And so from there, it launched that mental illness is something to be ashamed of, and there's a huge taboo. I won't go into indicting pharmaceutical companies, historical psychiatry, or insurance companies, because I think they are part of the bigger picture of what maintains this idea of stigma and mental illness. So part of the work that lies ahead is really reframing the narrative. In fact, we propose in the work that I do that your mental health is actually your mental wealth, that you are in full control of wellness funds that you can withdraw at any time. But you have to know that they're there. And a lot of people don't even talk about it. In fact, they ignore it. until they get so overwhelmed, it's impossible. So once you can sort of begin to frame the narrative, begin to invite people to think differently. And you begin to see that culture, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual identity, persons with disabilities, there's a whole range of diversity. And each of them has their own psychology, how they navigate social, environmental spaces. And it's important to understand each of those nuances. And so, really recruiting service providers to work with those various populations is going to be essential. Because again, everybody has it, irrespective of whether you live domestically or globally, man or woman, it doesn't matter. But the key issue is, how do you manage it? The first thing you got to talk about it. And so one of the things we started in our program with the National Basketball Players Association is what we call a mental health literacy portal. So we have about 90 different links to password protected portal athletes can go into and really learn about what are we even talking about when we talk about mental health, mental illness, mental wellness. What does that really mean? And we provide examples and literature that they can read, because it's important for us to educate people so that they can be active participants in keeping themselves balanced and having a language, having a way of looking at the world so that they have their eyes and ears set on those in their circle of influence, their family, their teammates, for example. And so that's the purpose there. So recruitment is necessary, but reframing the narrative is super important. Acknowledging that culture, race, ethnicity, all those markers of identity are very, very different, fundamentally fuel how people navigate the space in the world. And it's important to understand. And short of understanding all of that, it's going to be hard to be an effective psychologist, mental health person, because there is no one size fits all formula. There just isn't. And it's important to really understand the individual and how he or she is navigating the space that they now occupy.
Absolutely. Speaking of stigma surrounding mental illness, like you mentioned, I come from an Iranian background. I am an Iranian immigrant, and I've lived in the States for the past 6 years. I've been very lucky to have grown up in a family that's very open-minded. However, that even took work, a lot of work, because, the generation before them and their own generation went through mental challenges, and it was looked at with the same stigma. And I'm really aware of the work that it takes. And I think it really leaves a scar. And as someone who's fascinated by your concept of invisible tattoos, I would love it if you could tell us more.
Sure. Invisible tattoos is a concept that I came up with because it really sort of captured early childhood experiences with trauma. I'm very visual, and so I always draw pictures for people to resonate. That's how I learn best. So the invisible tattoos follows the following analogy. When somebody decides to get a tattoo, it's a choice. It has very symbolic meaning, depending on where it is placed on the body, because the body is different sensory points. It can hurt like a son of a gun. At a minimum, it's discomfort. It's just uncomfortable, but it's no way to get around the pain and discomfort. It's fully colored, depending on how much ink you put on. It could take weeks. But when you have the polished, finished product, you're very proud of it. It looks good. But lastly, if at some point down the road you get tired of it and you want to erase it, you can't go in the bathroom and wash it with soap and water. It's there. And when you're fully clothed, nobody knows that you have one. The only person that really knows is you. So I use that analogy because many studies have shown that a lot of people are walking around with a lot of baggage. Let me just say it in that way. In fact, it's common to know that Everybody has baggage. So there's really only two questions on the table ever. How many pieces of luggage do you have and what's packed inside each bag? When you look at some of the studies, I'm particularly referring to a huge study that was published in 1998, somewhere in there. It's called the ACE study, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was a big study by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente Hospital. Close to 18,000 patients, ranging from teenage to, I think, 65 and older, well educated, a fair income, but it was a good population. The question at the start of that study was, to what degree do early physical health issues have an impact on later adult life? Because prior to that, the American Academy of Physicians came on record saying fully 2/3 of office visits by adults 40 years of age and older are for stress-related disorders. In other words, a lot of it's preventable. So with all of that, they discovered that there was a lot of adverse childhood experiences, trauma, basically. And they list 13 categories of trauma, from parental divorce, incarceration of parents, mental illness, abuse, physical, sexual, emotional. But essentially, one of the key findings is this. If you were to take out your cell phone right now and open up to your directory and somehow closed your eyes and could randomly select 100 people out of your own phone directory, and this is true for the audience, presumably everybody in your directory is somebody you know, love, and value. The data are exceedingly clear that 65 out of 100 of those people, 2/3, would have had from 1 to 4 adverse childhood experiences in their life, the earliest of which, not uncommonly, would have occurred before the age of 10. Now, when somebody, a child, single-digit age kid, is experiencing trauma, they do not have the cognitive sophistication or emotional intelligence, one, to understand really what's going on, let alone the long-term implications of it. But they know almost innately and intuitively that something's not right, and it's painful. But they don't have a language to articulate it. Even though that exists, the body is recording all of that. And each emotion that gets triggered is equivalent to an inkwell into which a tattoo artist dips his or her pen to draw ink to etch on your body. And so when you have a tsunami wave of emotions, that's all that ink. And that collectively inks indelibly visual images and reminders of past traumas. Now, again, because we live in a society, in the world, domestic and globally, we don't talk about it. We just keep our clothes on, so to speak, emotionally, and don't hide it. But the other thing that we know for sure, let's say you had a traumatic experience as a kid, but somehow managed to work through it, went to school, have a job, and you're doing just wonderful by all markers. Well, when you have things like COVID, when you have things like wars over in your home country, when you have other world unrest, it's pretty dramatic. And you are now sitting in the midst of another traumatic event. Clearly, a lot of emotions are going to surface as a result of your current experience of that trauma. And those emotions will range across intensity. Some days it's going to be real overwhelming, some days not so much, but it's going to go back and forth. But if you were to really take a moment to process what the heck is happening, what specifically how you were feeling, not necessarily the incident, how you were feeling, most adults will see a direct correlation between the feelings they had as a kid and the feelings that they have now. And so that intensity of current experience of trauma is at one level an opportunity to re-examine some of that stuff that happened long ago. So while trauma and the experiences feel overwhelming and not good, it's always important to acknowledge that, but also look at the opportunity, because a lot of times people don't reconcile their issues. They just sort of bury it, try to get through it, make the best at life as best they can, and for the most part succeed at it. And so figure that, well, it's all past me now, but it isn't. And again, it wasn't until here in America when we had COVID here a couple of years ago, at the peak of COVID, everybody was literally shut down. You couldn't go to restaurants, barbershops, school, everything was virtual. I mean, you literally were closed out of the world. That's when we saw an exponential increase in calls to crisis hotlines, domestic violence, a whole bunch of stuff. Because when you go to work, when you go to the gym, when you go work out, whatever, those are outlets from which you receive nourishment. And it allows you to discharge stuff. Well, if those outlets are taken from you, you're left with just your head and everything that piles up. And that can get overwhelming. So everybody has what we call invisible tattoos, which are remembrances of the past that were not pleasant. But somehow we packaged it and seemed to get by. And we do get by until we don't. And so when it explodes, it's important to then acknowledge, okay, something is still here. Let's sit down and be still and really listen to what that is, and talk with either a therapist, a confidant, on an ongoing basis to try to resolve whatever it is going on.
Right. I really like your reference to COVID and how it changed the state of mental health across the world, really. But, we saw a lot of it in America. I think something that happened during COVID, a turn that was taken for the worse, was the increase in use of social media. With social media, I always feel like there is always this pressure to keep up, to put on this facade to show that you're living a happy life to a bunch of strangers. I've always been fascinated about that. I actually recently read a book by Jonathan Haidt it's called The Anxious Generation. It's about how it actually relates pretty well to that study, adverse childhood experiences.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how children and teenagers, young adults are influenced by social media. And it clearly outlines that mental health has taken a turn for the worse, which COVID really did not help with. I wonder where you see social media fall, because I think it can be a tool. It can be used for a lot of good. This very podcast, which I hope is educating to my audience, is going to be on social media. But it can also be a tool for the bad. It can make things worse, especially when it comes to mental health. So I'm curious about your take on this.
Well, social media, as you rightly say, in my opinion, Ali, is that it's a tool. Mm-hmm. It's a way of connecting. It's a way of exploring issues. It's a way of, again, staying in touch with people, particularly in circumstances such as COVID, prevent the actual contact when you can't go to class. Well, there's a way of exchanging information. So I think there's a lot of value in social media. The flip side of that coin, though, there's a lot of damage, because social media in its current form is very much unregulated. People say what they want to say, when they want to say it, how they want to say it, to whomever. And there's an element of disguise, because you're talking to your cell phone or your computer, not really engaging with somebody face to face. So you say stuff that you would not say in front of them, but it gives you sort of artificial permission to just say what you got to say and shoot from the hip. A number of studies have shown that there are a lot of adverse consequences of that, because there's a lot of folk who are very vulnerable to input and negativity, brutality, racism, sexism, hatred. all of that is just open game, open field for people just to show targets. In fact, there's a study done by Fifth Pro, which is European football, the National Basketball Players Association, and the WNBA. And if you look up Fifth Pro, WNBA, NBPA, social media abuse, it was a study that we released a couple years ago, maybe. It clearly shows the impact, the adverse impact, significantly adverse impact of social media on elite athletes. Because the things that they, in fact, race and gender identity are two categories that are just really prolifically bad. So social media impacts everybody. A companion report has just been released in the end of 2023 by the U.S. Surgeon General, the title of which is Loneliness and Isolation, a Global Epidemic. So what he is suggesting and what the report suggests as a result of social media isolation and a number of other factors, despite the advances in technology and communication and ways of touching people, going across continents, going across states, going across the country, literally connecting yourself to the world, despite all of those advances, there's an epidemic proportion of loneliness and isolation globally. So people are really tuning out, are not engaging in what they need to engage in. And some of that, I think, is regulation. It's not regulated. There's a whole science about why it isn't. But the fact is, it isn't. Yet it's continuing to grow in its use. The thing that really scares me is the growing quickly fascination of the tool of artificial intelligence. That's going to add exponentially to this equation. And I think we are not quite caught up with how to manage all of that. So again, as you said at the outset, social media is a tool that can work. There's a lot of usefulness to it. There's a lot of adverse consequences to it, though. And we have to be very, very mindful. And some of those adverse consequences because of lack of accountability, a lack of regulation. And some of that, most of it is politicized, is rooted in economics. It's a lot of other factors and variables. But it's a danger, and it's a growing danger, and will continue to be a danger if we don't take a serious look at it and make some different decisions.
I always think when it comes to social media as a tool that can be used for the good and the bad, I always think to my father's analogy. He always tells me it's like things that can be used for both good and bad are like a knife with a red handle. If a 1 to 2 year old sees it, they just want to grab it by the red handle and probably put it in their mouth. Very dangerous. But in an emergency situation, if there's a surgeon present and they wield the knife, they can save someone's life. So I always think back to that, and it's very interesting to me. About artificial intelligence, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Her.
Yes.
I feel like that's a future we are getting very close to, and it scares me.
Well, only in my opinion, it's not a future, it's a here and now reality.
Right.
That Her movie came out years ago. But that tells you that a whole lot of people knew about it. And it's just now coming to a more public face.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to be very interesting if we don't understand what we're doing.
Absolutely.
And it's going to have a lot of adverse impacts. And again, this isn't the forum for all of that, but it's something that we need to be aware of. And ultimately, getting back to one of the goals of this particular conversation, it adversely impacts mental health because people are already vulnerable based on their childhood, based on other current circumstances, based on experiences of race, class, culture, ethnicity, sexism, racism, all the ism, ideological beliefs and practices. All of those things frame the space that people occupy and how they navigate. And so when you have these other tools such as social media, such as now AI, There's again the flip side of the coin conversation that has some good, but also has some good. There's some bad, and we're not really caught up with how to really manage both of those things in a way that's fair, equitable, makes sense, and where we maximize its utility.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk to you about those outlets that you mentioned earlier, particularly exercise. You were mentioning how certain outlets were taken away from people because of COVID shutdowns. I am currently involved with exercise research, and it's sort of a deeper dive into how exercise benefits health on a molecular and cellular level. What I'm really interested in is to understand if physical health is downstream from mental health or the other way around, or if they go hand in hand, and sort of see what your take on this is.
I believe they go hand in hand. I don't think one is better than the other. There's the physical health is more emphasized in part because it's sort of more normalized. If you go in with a headache, a broken leg, whatever, it's an okay thing to go get treatment for. But when you go in with depression, chronic anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, a whole range of uh, challenges, mental health challenges, then you don't, one, go in for help because it's a stigma. You try to be tough, gut it out, work through it, try to avoid sort of typical interventions because it's not supported. It's shunned. And there's some very active consequences for taking medications, for letting people know that you're vulnerable in these ways. And so they're both important, but one is favored over the other. And I think that's going to be an ongoing debate because it's important. And where it ties, you mentioned these outlets, and we'll talk about going to school, going to work, physical exercise based on the research you are now engaged in, going to church, synagogue, or temple, so your spiritual nourishment, having a hobby. See, all of those things, those outlets really pay two dividends. One is that you feel, actually more than two, you feel nourished for participating in it. You feel visible, valued, and appreciated. You feel a sense of mastery, a sense of competence, a sense of confidence. And all of that builds up and allows you to maintain sort of positive mental health because you are successful. And so when you have the erosion of that and a lockdown of each one of those outlets, you have no place to really reaffirm your competence, confidence, your emotional nourishment. It's like the well ran dry. And then you're left to all that space between your two ears. And that's when all that stuff starts coming back that you pressed down all these years, all that negative stuff. And then you don't make sense of it and overwhelms you because it just comes to the surface. And you got to be real careful about that. So outlets serve a purpose of an escape. So you get the nourishment and validation. But the other benefit it brings you is you don't have to deal with all that other stuff that you don't want to deal with. And so, again, when those options are erased, that's all you're left with is your stuff, your baggage. And you got to force to unpack it. And that's something you're not ready to do, don't want to do. And it has implications that you don't fully understand. So therefore, it's very scary. And there's an opportunity in all. Because when you are supported with people, with confidence, with professionals who really know what they're doing, you can really find that your pain can be turned into your purpose. Students often, or patients often discover that while it felt like life happens to them, life is happening for them. You can learn how to turn your stumbling blocks into stepping stones. There's a lot of those analogies. Every setback is camouflage for a setup to go farther than you ever hoped, dreamed, or desired. And so really, a lot of people find their superpower when they're dealing with traumatic events. In fact, in the trauma literature, there is a concept called post-traumatic growth. In short, what that concept suggests, Ali, is that there's zero trauma ever in the world, including the big ticket traumas, where at some point there isn't some growth and healing, new insight, light bulb insights of awareness, etc. People come together differently, intrapersonal growth. So you don't see it on the front end or in the middle of all that stuff, but it's inevitable. So part of getting through some of the trauma is really realizing that there's something of value on the other end of this. But it does take teamwork to make that dream work, to really pull out of somebody where they're at. And that's where you find your superpowers. But I tell my students in the class I teach, I have a trauma class. If a 40-year-old patient came to you, let's say you came to me, Ali, as a patient, or came to one of my students. Mm-hmm. There's three things I would know right the minute I saw you, without you opening your mouth or me opening mine. One, that you're male. Two, I would guess your ethnicity. You mentioned it was Iranian, so I would say Iranian. But three, and most important, however old I think you are, all of those years, you got along without me. It's clear you're coming into me now for some healing and understanding and reconciliation of some kind because you're in some stage of brokenness. But at no point am I ever to believe that you don't have the innate genius and wisdom to get back on your path and travel because you got here successfully without me. And so I tell my students all the time, when you listen to your patients long enough, they will tell you what's wrong with them. When you listen to them just a little bit longer, they will tell you what you can do to make them feel better. So I teach my students that the real therapist in the room is not the therapist. The real therapist in the room and the healer is the patient who's coming in here. Because what you see beyond the visible and the immediate presentation of depression or anxiety is a person who has been successful and is 40 years old now in front of you, having navigated successfully. And so tapping into those superpowers, which are often hiding in plain sight, tucked behind pain and trauma, but are nonetheless there. And if you can really spend some time teaching patients, but teaching yourself as a healer how to listen, which is the biggest tool. In fact, I remind my students, if you spell out the word listen, L-I-S-T-E-N, and I ask my students, so give me a reasonable definition of what this means. And they tell me. And all of those definitions are very reasonable. But I often then tease them with the following. I says, now, what if I were to tell you that the way to maximize what those 6 letters spell is hidden in those 6 letters? And they'll look at me puzzled, and I say, yeah, if you move those letters around, you come up with the word silent. So the best way to listen is to be silent. The best way to listen to yourself is to be silent, because the body keeps the score, and a lot of information you seek is in here. The best way to listen to others in their journey, good and bad, is to be silent and let them talk and let them share. They will connect. That's where I went wrong. That's where I went off course. And find their way back home and get back on the road. So I'm getting a little bit off track here, but I just want to say that all of that healing is inside of us. There's opportunity in every tragedy, but you have to surround yourself with people who know what they're doing, who are there, going to be there for the long haul, very supportive, and a no hate zone, and allowing you to just co-participate in your journey of healing.
Absolutely. I Not sure if you know him, Stephen Colbert, that guy who hosts that late night show. I saw a video of him getting asked by this reporter. He's also famous, I forget their name, but getting asked, you said once that what punishments of God are not gifts. And he goes on to explain that he absolutely meant what he said because he thinks to exist is a gift, and all these hardships that we go through as humans are growth opportunities. That made me really think and reflect on my experiences. I think the harder my experiences have been, the more I grew from them. I always reflect back on my experiencing moving, my experience in moving to America at the age of 17, which was really not easy. I mean, people hear me speak English fluently and they're like, oh, it seems like you're a native speaker and you've lived here for a while. And I'm like, no, it's really 6 years ago. And it was really not easy adjusting to a new country, to a new culture, to a new language, because even to the language itself, there's a lot of culture behind it. And in retrospect, I'm glad that it happened. Even though when I was going through it, I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. I don't want to be experiencing this. But that growth, the idea of growth from trauma, which you mentioned earlier, I think.
Post-traumatic growth.
Post-traumatic growth really stands here as well.
And then, Ali, if I could add, one of the things that I didn't hear you say.
Absolutely.
You mentioned when you came over at 17, there was more of a challenge that people realized, or maybe even that you were realizing, integrating into a new space, new language, new culture.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip side of that coin is that you were also disconnecting from your host community, your homeland, your generational culture, your system of how things work. You never fully forgot that. But that was not part of your day-to-day reality. So you were both trying to connect and trying to hold on or resolve or somehow make peace with.
Absolutely.
So that's a big journey, and really understanding the duality of that transition is where your source of strength is going to come.
That's very interesting that you mentioned that. I never heard it be put in that way, but I always thought about how at some point I lost track of how the transition was completed. But I am still to this day aware that my community in Esfahan, Iran was very tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone had each other's backs. If someone got sick, the other families who knew them would get together and make them food and take care of them, take their children to school. And I think that was the most influential part of culture that I was missing when I moved here, because America is a very individualistic society and everyone sort of has to fend for themselves, which to this day doesn't really sit well with me, because the idea of having a community is, for me, the value, one of the many values to it is supporting one another. And I think this would be a good segue into my next question that I have for you. When it comes to support, particularly community support, how can communities do better for individuals? How can we be a community and not leave individuals to fend for themselves?
Well, again, I think you bring up several questions. One, I think when you look at cultural differences across the globe, America is very individualistic. You have pyramid thinking. There's only room at the top for one, and most of the people are at the bottom. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Other cultures, fully 2/3 of the rest of the world, actually has what we call a communal sense, a sense of bonding. I am my brother's keeper type mentality. And like I said, when you're sick, people chip in. When you're having good days, everybody's celebrating. And you don't know how much you are connected to that until you're not. And that's where you start missing all of that. But getting back to your question about how people can really do better at supporting, I think there's often an assumption that I might know how to support you as a young man, for example. You're a guy, I'm a guy, whatever. I'm a person of color, you have an ethnic heritage. So there's some commonalities. I know what you need. Wrong answer. We don't spend enough time hearing from you, for example. Like if you came to me as a patient, I would not say I'm Dr. So and so and I know what you need and here's a formula and a prescription. I say, Ali, tell me about your life. Tell me about the forces that shape the person you are now have become. You came to my office now because there's some stuff going on. Say a little bit about that. And you say, well, Dr. Parham, it was a struggle to get in here, but I just finally had to face XYZ challenge. The only thing out of my mouth is, Ali, say more about that. And why use just those four magic words? Because then you have a decision. Well, how much do I want to say? How in depth do I want to go? Does he really want to hear what I want to say? So let's say you say, okay, you say more about that. And it takes you back to when you were growing up in Iran, for example. Something's going to catch my ear. And guess what I'm going to say? Say more about that piece right there. And you're going to make that same decision. So you're buying into this conversation. You're making some decisions. You're willing to participate. And then you'll say more. If I can get you to a point of saying, say more about that for a third time, I can almost predict what your answer, what your reaction is going to be in probably 5 or 10 minutes. You're going to go, oh, you know what? That's what's been missing. It's going to come to you, that piece of the puzzle that was elusive, because you already have those answers. So part of getting people support is not defining for them what they need, but to hear from them in their own words how their lived experience is shaping their requests for support. But we don't listen to each other enough. That goes with parents to their kids. Now, parents clearly been around longer than their kids. But there's a nuanced experience that your kids are going through. The parents have no clue. When you, let's say, came over here at 17, I'm assuming your parents are here, but they were still more traditionally anchored to Iran.
Absolutely.
Well, you're a 17-year-old kid in America with all this American stuff going on. That had to be a conflict, some of which your parents didn't quite understand. They didn't raise kids here in America. And so there has to be an opportunity even for parents to say, Holly, how was your day today at school? And just listen about that. Not sort of be immediately parental and say, well, here's what you got to do. Back in the old country, here's what we did. I'm not saying that that's not good advice. Mm-hmm. Because it's advice that has sustained them and has allowed for generations and generations to thrive. But I think, and I guess where I'm going with this, Ali, context is everything. It's not something, it's everything. So even parents would have to know their kids. What is the context of now going to an American school system? Getting into jobs in America. Understanding difference and diversity and equity in America. The individual versus the communal approach. America versus where we came from. Through the eyes of a 17-year-old, that's very, very different. And so learning how to pay attention to the other is going to be important. In fact, I often remind my students, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because we are to listen twice as much we are to speak. If you really think about it, your body is designed with the number 2. You have 2 eyes. One is to see what's in front of you, but you can also train yourself to see what's not there. You have 2 arms to embrace or to keep at bay. You have 2 legs and 2 feet to walk to or to walk away from. So embedded in our own body is decisions about how to navigate life. But again, context in the America versus Iran versus wherever else you may be in the world. That's important to understand that. But people have to listen to you, to me, to whomever, to hear from your mouth, my mouth, what I need. And I think that's important.
I absolutely agree with you on that. One of the things that I do, I volunteer with this organization, Interfaith Refugee and Immigrant Services, IRIS. And, my role as a volunteer since I'm also a pre-medical student, I mean, I'm not a student anymore, but pre-med, and I am trying to pursue medicine, is to help immigrants and refugees who are just adjusting to this new system. They don't know what's going on, and they need someone to speak their language. They can convey certain things, but they really need someone who can convey their pain and suffering.
Yeah.
So that's where my passions lied, and I've been doing it. I realize now, also listening to you more, that people say a lot more than you think they say.
That's right.
And I
Not
totally
only
agree.
do that, but I go as far as to say it's not humanly possible, not humanly possible to not communicate. Saying nothing is communicating. If you and I are talking about something and you're eye to eye, just focusing, you're really paying attention. And I ask you a question that's a little bit more difficult. And you start curling your hair, you look over to the side or start looking up. Right there, you're communicating something's different. And you got to be in tune with all of that. And so the best way to work with this refugee group is really listen to their lived experience
Mm-hmm.
and force yourself not to put your journey to America as the template to which you see and experience what they're doing. It's important, your context and your journey, because you are visible evidence of a survivor of that transition. That said, it's still important for you to listen to their struggle, their
Absolutely.
fears, their hopes, their dreams, because that's often that they don't get. And you are providing a wonderful service.
And it's really part of successful mentorship
Absolutely.
yeah, exactly. So when you look at someone's experience and you put yourself in their shoes and then relate that to your experience, you can provide them with a lot more useful advice
That's right.
and guidance. I
But
do want to,
also, if you were listening to a refugee and they're just sort of brand new in the journey,
yes,
not only are you providing help and service and a listening ear and value to their life, but they are also providing value to yours.
absolutely.
Because something they're going through now is going to trigger, I remember that. And it gives you time to sort of reverse and to really think differently and to really admire and affirm how far you really have come. So anytime you're interacting with people, it's always a bi-directional gift. You are giving them something, but they are also giving you, and you got to be open to both of those exchange.
Absolutely. I
Uh,
fully agree. I have sort of a selfish question for myself, and that is
okay.
because the question I have for you is about mental literacy, mental health literacy that you also mentioned earlier. As someone who works with a lot of people who are homesick, who are going through that challenging transition, or let alone, in daily life, sees a lot of people and actually desires to be a helpful force, be an impactful and positive person in these people's lives. What would be your advice to me to be more literate in mental health and be of better health other than, being silent and listening?
Well, I think two things. One, I think it is important to understand current definitions of mental health. And there are a couple of major reference books called, one is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I think it's version 5 now. But that's essentially a dictionary of all the definitions
Mm-hmm.
of what mental health, mental illness is. Uh, that aside, studying the history of where all of that came from is even more important. Because a lot of the early roots of psychology are borrowed from the medical model. And early models of medicine were rooted, and some continue to be rooted, in pathology. And pathology is the study of disease. So the birth of psychology was borrowing heavily from a disease model. There's something wrong with you. That's where the word disorder comes from. That's where the word dysfunctional comes from. There's something wrong with you, Ali. So I think you have to understand that historical context and the contemporary use of it. That said, I would also encourage you to study other systems. I was very much influenced, for example, by Eastern philosophy and African philosophy, and particularly when I started getting into martial arts and currently Tai Chi, I really began to see the world differently. For example, if you were coming to me as a patient and you were antisocial, you were sort of deviating from what the normal pattern is, well, I could say, well, Ali is antisocial. He's resistant. Or I could say, he wasn't born like this. So maybe there's something self-protective in his behaviors. He's guarding against something. So if you're always antisocial, keeping people at a distance, not engaging, I might suspect, for example, that you were hurt at some point in the past and that didn't feel good. So your strategy for coping from here forward, your self-protective strategy, keep people at a distance, because if you don't let them in, they can't hurt you. So it's understanding sort of the traditional way of looking at that, but also putting a different, more modern spin on it. You're engaging in self-protection, and that makes a lot of sense. And self-protection is human, it's innate, it's normal. So my goal as a therapist, if I ever treated you, is to teach you not how to not be defensive, but how to self-protect differently. Not self-protect in ways that are going to continue to harm and get in the way, but how to self-protect in ways that are going to facilitate you moving forward. And that's what you have to do. Study the history, but put a different spin on it in contemporary, the expression of all of that. In fact, I tell my students, when you look at this, the word disorder and dysfunction, as I mentioned, you cannot spell the word dysfunction without spelling the word function. You can't spell the word disorder without spelling the word order. So there's something functional in what seems to be dysfunctional. And there's some order in what appears to be disorder. And seeking to understand what the benefit and the payoff is of those current decisions to engage in that kind of self-protection, for me, has been invaluable.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that great piece of advice. My major in undergrad was biology, and I went to UCLA. The way that biology is structured is through an ecological and evolutionary lens. And I really like the phrase that says, it's a feature, not a bug, or it's not a bug, it's a feature. I think that self-protection is a feature that can go wrong. A lot of diseases, because the whole idea of evolution is that evolution gets rid of maladaptive things that reduce your survival in nature.
Yeah.
And so over the course of generations, that trait disappears because it's born less and less and less to the point where it doesn't exist anymore. But there's also adaptive benefits to certain things. I think this really relates well to the idea of self-protection. I mean, in nature, we want to protect ourselves, and we are social animals.
Yeah.
And I think changing how we protect ourselves and finding the order and the disorder and finding navigating through the randomness of these thoughts would be the way to go.
Well, I go even further. If you were to come to me and say, Dr. P, we have an appointment, but I have a flu bug, I'm feverish and nauseous, and you came up with a whole lot of a profile of symptoms. I might ask you, and you might say, well, Dr. P, I'm trying to get better. Maybe we can meet next week. So you're communicating to me that you have a sick body trying to get well. And I'll be okay, take care of yourself, get better, and all that. But I also might say, before you hang up all that, I'm wondering, do you have a sick body getting well? Or do you have a well body fighting off sickness? See, it's very different perception here. You don't have a sick body. You have a well body. The fact that you have a fever sucks. It doesn't feel good, but it's a sign that there's an infection in your body. And that's sort of the biological, physiological forest fire trying to burn that stuff out. You have aches and pain. Yeah, that doesn't feel good. It feels uncomfortable. And you want to take a pill to get rid of that pain. And that makes perfect sense. But the pain is also a symptom. I use the analogy of a smoke detector. If you and I right now are talking in this calm space, if a smoke detector went off in your room right there, I doubt two things. One, I doubt that you would stay on this Zoom as confident, as comfortable and calm as you are. And two, once you disengage from this conversation, I doubt that you go get a step stool and take the smoke detector off the ceiling to go get it fixed. You see, the fact that it went off, Ali, suggests that it's working and it's inviting you to pay attention. Well, again, when you have headaches and distress of any kind, physiological or psychological, that's a smoke detector. That something else is happening. And those are symptoms. And symptoms are problematic. Problematic meaning if you continue to persist with those symptoms, they're going to get worse. So you got to do something about it. But absolutely, you can take this to the bank. There is nothing that's problematic that is ever the problem. It's a symptom. So getting to the root cause of what's really causing that headache, what's really causing those joints to not feel good and smooth and fluid. That's the bigger picture. And so it's the same way with mental health and psychology. People don't just sort of behave badly just because. There's a reason and a rhyme to why they make those kinds of decisions. And it's important to understand, okay, where did that come from? Because their expression of deviation is really a symptom. Yes, it's problematic. It is not the problem. It's the smoke detector, the emotional smoke detector, if you will, that something else needs to be addressed. So there's an alignment to how you read. And again, when you're silent and you can really see this, you begin to see a bigger picture.
Absolutely.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So listen to your internal smoke detectors.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And be proactive about it so you can take action.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
I really appreciate all your insights that you've shared with us today, Dr. Parham. It's kind of a tradition on my show to ask my guest to leave us with an empowering message. And so I wanted to see if you have a message or mantra that you'd like to share with our listeners to help them feel more empowered, more confident to confront mental health challenges and ensure resilience.
Well, there's three that come to mind. The first two are, I'm not quite sure who mentioned or phrased these mantras, but they're very important in my life. The third one I'll share, it actually came from a movie that I saw, but the statement was so profound. The first mantra is, again, and I'm not quite sure who to attribute it to, but it goes like this. The two most important days in a person's life are the day they're born and the day they find out why. It's all about finding your purpose. And there is support of good ways of finding it, but also through trauma and tragedy, you can find your purpose. But those are the two goals that you have. The second is this, particularly when you're in tragedy and trauma. It has to do with whenever and wherever shadows have been cast. It must mean that there's light nearby. Because shadows can't be cast without light. So even when you experience some dark spaces and shadows that are hovering over you, that's real. It feels awful. You wish it wasn't there. And it means that there's light somewhere. And I often tell students and patients, the light about which I speak is inside you and is inside everybody you allow into your circle of influence. So yeah, acknowledge where you're at, but understand that there's always light, often hiding in plain sight. The third and final module comes from a movie, and it was based on a true story, actually. And it's called, I think it's the Encryption Code or something, but it's a true story.
Mm.
But there's a line in there, and I would encourage your readers to take a look at that, your listeners to take a look at them, because it's tied to AI, it's tied to Apple computers, it's tied to all of that stuff. But there's a quote in there that I've always remembered. There are people in this world who no one ever imagined anything of, who go on to accomplish what no one ever imagined. So let me repeat that one more time. There are people in this world who no one ever imagined anything of, who go on to accomplish what no one ever imagined. So hidden inside each of us is innate genius and talent that sometimes we are afraid to tap into, but it's nonetheless there. And it's there for the taking. It's part of how you withdraw those wellness funds. You were put on this earth for a reason at this point in time in the world's history. And at the end of the day, when it's time for us to transition to wherever we transition to, I'm talking about death, you can't take a U-Haul to heaven. So all of the trophies and the money and the fortune and the fame, you can't take it with you. And if that's true, which is code for it is, and the question is, and the only question is, what are you here for? So finding your purpose, understanding that trauma, tragedy, crises come, and embedded in every crisis is an opportunity. So how do you really calm yourself down, acknowledge what's going on, so never deny it, but find the post-traumatic growth experience that's there, guaranteed to find it if you go looking for it, if you even know that it's there. If you believe that life just sucks, that's all you're going to be stuck with. So really never downplay who you are. People can do unimaginable things if they just allow themselves to listen to who they are and what they're all about. And the way to do that is to be silent. And the last thing I'll say, people, you will never see your reflection in running water. It is only when the water is still that your reflected image will begin to emerge. So again, it talks about stillness and being in the moment. All the truth that you seek is not out there. It's here inside of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing all your profound insights with us, Dr. Parham. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Ali, for the opportunity to speak, to share some conversation with you, to learn from you, and to also, though, acknowledge that you aren't becoming a physician. You are discovering how much a physician and a healer you already are. And everything you're going through now is a manifestation of what you already are. So don't try to become anything. So the word become or becoming suggests that you're not there yet. There's a deficit, there's a gap, there's a hole to fill. You got to come up to speed. And while everybody knows sort of what that means, it's still you're walking around with a negative mindset. You are discovering the genius that you already are as a physician, in my opinion.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
That means a lot coming from you, especially. Thank you so much.
Keep up the good work. All the blessings to you, and let's stay in touch.